I used to think that staying quiet was a kind of wisdom, an invisible shield that could protect a family from unnecessary conflict. For most of my life, I believed that if I moved softly, lived simply, and let people assume whatever they wanted about me, things would eventually sort themselves out. For a long time, that seemed true. My silence felt harmless, even noble. But silence doesn't always teach people the right lessons. Sometimes it teaches them to stop seeing you at all. It was early morning in late October when my phone buzzed against the edge of my kitchen sink. A thin strip of pale light pushed through the blinds, washing over my small apartment in a muted gray. I had just poured myself a mug of strong coffee, the cheap kind I'd been drinking for years, when I glanced at the screen and saw my daughter's name. "Marin?" I answered. Her voice came through with the distracted rhythm of someone juggling a dozen things at once. "Hey, Dad. I won't take long. I just wanted to tell you something before the plans go out to everyone." I didn't know what she meant, but something in her tone tightened the air around me. There are moments when you don't need the words to know the shape of what's coming. And just as she inhaled to continue, I felt the need to steady myself. A small reminder to anyone listening to this later. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Marin hesitated only a heartbeat before continuing. "We're doing a family trip next month. A full week in Crescent Bay. The kids are excited and Livia already planned half the activities." "That sounds beautiful," I said, keeping my voice even. "It will be. It's one of those big shoreline villas, private dock, heated pool, the works." I could almost picture it. I'd never been. Not because I couldn't afford to go, just because I'd never been invited. Then came the pause, long enough to clarify everything without a single word spoken. "We didn't book you a room, Dad." There it was. "It's not because we don't want you there," she continued quickly. "It's just, the place has a certain atmosphere, and Livia thinks the pictures will look cleaner if it's all one theme. Her family's very particular about aesthetics." Aesthetics. A neat way of saying, you don't fit the image we're trying to show the world. "I understand," I murmured, but not in the way she thought. "We'll take lots of photos," she added, as though that made up for it. "But maybe next year it'll make more sense." "Maybe," I said. We spent a few more minutes on small talk. The weather, her youngest learning to ride a bike, the new sofa she'd ordered. Nothing that hinted at the decision she had just delivered. When she finally hung up, the apartment returned to its familiar quiet. I lifted my coffee and leaned against the counter, letting the steam rise around my hands. There was no anger, no sharp spike of hurt, just a steady, sinking awareness that the distance between us wasn't an accident. It had been growing for years, inch by inch, while I convinced myself it wasn't. My apartment was small but comfortable. One bedroom, neat living space, warm lamp in the corner, a window overlooking the river. People saw it and assumed it reflected my bank account. They were wrong. I walked over to the drawer beneath the bookshelf and pulled out a flat wooden box. Inside were pieces of a life almost no one knew I'd lived. Old project credentials, commendations, sealed financial documents I hadn't opened in years. I'd spent more than 3 decades working in a role that demanded discretion, consistency, and a certain kind of intelligence most people never see. My daughter-in-law, however, only saw the thrift store jacket I wore on holidays, only noticed the old boots, the used car, the modest apartment. She assumed those things meant I was a man scraping by, someone who brought nothing valuable to a glamorous family trip. The truth was, the life I lived was a choice, one I made deliberately, hoping it would teach my daughter humility rather than entitlement. Maybe that hope had been misplaced. I closed the wooden box, set it back in the drawer, and looked around the room again. Small, simple, intentional. If Livia believed I didn't belong on that family vacation, then she was about to learn something she'd never once considered. Not through anger, not through revenge, through reality. Because what happened after that call, starting with a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, changed the entire course of the trip they thought I'd never be part of. For the rest of that day, my apartment felt heavier than usual. Not because of what Marin said, but because of what it revealed. There's a difference between being forgotten and being deliberately excluded. And this wasn't forgetfulness. It was design. I tried to go about my usual routine, washed the dishes, wiped the counters, sorted through mail I'd ignored for days, but the words kept circling back in my mind like a quiet echo. The place has a theme. You don't match it. I had lived modestly for reasons that once felt noble. Now those same choices were being used to push me to the edges of my own family. Late that afternoon, while I was brewing another cup of coffee, my phone buzzed again. A message this time, but not from Marin. It was from someone I hadn't heard from in years. "Are you free tomorrow? I need to speak with you, it's important." No name attached, just a number I recognized from my past life. A number I had never deleted. I sat down slowly, reading it twice. The last time this person reached out, it was over confidential work. The kind of assignment that required quiet skill and an even quieter exit. I had walked away from that world for a reason. But my instincts, the ones I kept buried, stirred. I typed back, 11 in the morning, Riverside Station. When I put the phone down, the apartment seemed to shrink around me as if aware of the shift. I hadn't planned to revisit my past, but something about Marin's call made me realize I couldn't keep living as though my life ended the day I stopped working. If my daughter-in-law wanted to judge me by the image I presented, then maybe it was time to remember the version of myself that existed before I chose to go quiet. The next morning I arrived early at the station. A soft drizzle blurred the edges of the city skyline, turning everything into a watercolor of muted grays. I stood under the awning, hands in my pockets, pretending the chill didn't reach me. A tall figure approached, older now but unmistakable. It was Rain Hartwell, once my partner on some of the most complex intelligence audits in the Northwest region. We had uncovered things together that would never make the news, things that required a steady hand and a quiet mind. "Good to see you again," Rain said, offering a nod instead of a handshake. "You too," I replied. He motioned toward a bench beneath the awning. "Mind if we sit?" I lowered myself carefully, conscious of the stiffness that had become normal with age. Rain watched the passing trains for a moment before speaking. "I wouldn't have reached out unless it mattered," he said. "I'm retiring soon, cleaning out old files. And while doing that, I came across something with your name on it." I waited. "You remember the audit of the Runeport development?" he asked. Of course I did. It had been one of the trickiest cases we handled. Money flowing through unusual channels, several shell companies, and a conclusion that never sat right with me. "I remember," I said. "Turns out your instincts were right. A lot was buried that shouldn't have been." I studied him, trying to understand what this had to do with me now. Rain reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin, sealed envelope. "You should see this. I didn't feel comfortable leaving it with the department." I opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of documents, property transfers, beneficiary records, dormant account statements. At first they seemed unrelated, but then my breath caught. One of the names tied to the accounts belonged to Marin's husband's family, Livia's father. "Why are you giving this to me?" I asked quietly. "Because it involves your daughter's in-laws, and because whatever they've been doing behind the scenes, you should know about it before anything else unfolds." My pulse steadied into something colder. I had never cared about their money or their image, but I did care about my daughter. And now exclusion from a vacation seemed like a trivial symptom of something larger, something with roots extending into places that could affect her far more deeply than an unspoken insult. Rain stood. "I know you walked away from all this, and I respect that, but this touches your family." I folded the papers and slipped them into my coat. "I'll look into it. Be careful," he warned before walking away. Rain tapped steadily on the metal roof above me. I stayed seated long after Rain left, staring at the sheets of gray sky beyond the tracks. I had thought I was dealing with a daughter-in-law's insecurity and snobbery. I hadn't realized there was something buried under all of it, something far more dangerous, something that made their trip to Crescent Bay feel less like a family getaway and more like a distraction. What I discovered when I started digging into those documents didn't just explain why they didn't want me on that trip. It exposed a secret they were desperate to keep hidden. I spent the next few hours at home with the envelope spread across my kitchen table. The same table I'd sanded and refinished myself nearly 10 years earlier. Papers, dates, transfers. None of it made full sense yet, but the patterns were familiar. Money movement always leaves a fingerprint no matter how carefully someone tries to smear the surface. There were accounts registered under Livia's father's name, some dormant, some recently reactivated. Traces of funds routed through a real estate project on the coast, Crescent Bay of all places, the same place they were traveling to. At first I thought it was coincidence, the kind that makes you pause only briefly. But when I looked closer, when I followed the oldest transaction trail, the truth landed like a weight on my chest. My daughter-in-law's family hadn't just booked a vacation. They were going to Crescent Bay to finalize something I wasn't meant to see, let alone understand. And Livia had been very clear. Our trip is a peaceful break. No stress, no outsiders. I remembered the coldness in her voice when she said the word outsiders. I hadn't realized she meant me in such absolute terms. The rain outside thickened into a steady curtain, blurring the windows. I took a breath, gathered the files, and placed them into a folder. Then I called Marin. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, everything okay?" I forced calm into my voice. "I'm coming by." Marin hesitated. I could almost hear her weighing how Livia would react. Sure. Livia's at a hair appointment. You can come." The hesitation stung more than the exclusion itself. I walked to Marin's apartment, the folder tucked beneath my coat. The elevator hummed as I rose to the 8th floor. By the time she opened the door, her brows were pinched. "You look serious," she said softly. I stepped inside. The place smelled like her lemon diffuser. Bright, familiar, yet something in the air felt different, sharper. "I want to show you something," I said. We sat on the couch. I laid out the documents and explained only what I could verify. No assumptions, no speculation. Marin listened, eyes widening gradually. "These accounts, they're tied to Crescent Bay?" she asked. "Why?" "That's what I intend to find out," I replied. "But you should know about it." She leaned back, processing. "Dad, this is big, but why would Livia's family involve us or keep it quiet?" "You tell me," I said gently. "When did they start planning the trip?" She blinked. "A month ago. Maybe more." "Why? How did they decide who was going?" Marin swallowed. "Livia said it was a family thing. Her father wanted everyone close." I waited. "And what about me?" I asked. Marin's expression flickered. Guilt, frustration, helplessness. "Livia said you'd make things complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated quietly. "She thinks you ask too many questions." She paused. "About money, about her family's decisions. She said you analyze everything." I exhaled slowly. Of all the reasons to exclude me, that one made the most sense. And yet it was the most dangerous. "Marin," I said softly, "the only reason I ever question anything is to protect you." She looked away. "I know. I didn't think it mattered. I didn't know she cut herself off." "What?" I asked. She hesitated too long. "Marin," she sighed. "She said you were stuck in the past, that you didn't understand boundaries, and that if you came along you'd see things that aren't your business." That settled heavily between us. Then Marin whispered, "Dad, do you think she's hiding something?" "I think," I said carefully, "she's involved in something bigger than she wants either of us to know." Marin rubbed her temples. "She's not dangerous. Not on purpose," I agreed. "But people connected to questionable money often are." Marin froze. The words hit her harder than I expected. Before she could respond, keys jingled at the front door. Livia's voice carried from the hallway. "Marin, why's the light on in the living room?" Marin jumped, panic flashing across her face. "Dad, you should go." Her instinct wasn't to protect me. It was to protect her marriage from conflict. That hurt more than the exclusion, more than the documents, more than anything Livia had said. I stood, gathered the folder, and walked toward the secondary exit, the old stairwell they never used. "Dad," Marin whispered. I paused. "I'll look at everything," she promised. "I just need time." Time. The one thing that always runs out. I nodded once and slipped out just as Livia entered the living room. As I descended the stairwell, echoing footsteps behind me, one thought kept repeating in my mind. If they were willing to hide something this significant, excluding me from a vacation wasn't the insult. It was the warning. But the real shock came 2 days later, when I discovered exactly what that family trip was actually designed to accomplish, and why my absence was absolutely essential to them. 2 days passed in a strange quiet. Marin didn't call. Livia certainly didn't. And I went about my routine. Morning walk, small breakfast, checking the news, while the folder of documents sat on my kitchen counter like a ticking clock. Every so often I opened it again. Not because I didn't understand the contents, but because each time I looked, the pattern grew sharper. Crescent Bay wasn't simply a vacation spot. It was a place where property changed hands quietly, where local businesses were bought up in clusters, where money flowed in without leaving much record behind, all perfectly legal on the surface. And yet something about the timing, the secrecy, the accounts registered under Livia's family name made my gut tighten. I wasn't the type to imagine conspiracies, but I had spent 40 years working in procurement where spotting inconsistencies was part of staying alive professionally. Patterns were my language, and the deeper I read, the clearer it felt. Someone in Livia's family was moving funds through Crescent Bay, and this vacation was timed with the next phase. I had been excluded not because I'd asked too many questions. I was excluded because I might understand the answers. By the morning they were set to leave, I had made my decision. I would not sit at home waiting for explanations that never came. I packed one overnight bag, placed the documents inside, grabbed my passport, and went to the airport. Crescent Bay was a 2-hour flight, the kind where families boarded in bright clothes and sunglasses, chatting about beaches and buffets. I kept to myself and landed just after midday. The sun hit immediately, thick warm air rolling in from the coastline. Crescent Bay looked like the kind of place travel influencers exaggerated for views. Shimmering water, minimalist hotels, palm-lined boardwalks. But beneath the surface, the place hummed with intent. I checked into a modest seaside lodge a mile from the resort where Marin and Livia's family were staying. The owner handed over a key attached to a wooden tag shaped like a seashell. Friendly smile, warm voice. And yet even he asked, "Business or family?" "Both," I said. He nodded as if he understood exactly what that meant. After dropping my bag, I walked toward the main strip. Crescent Bay wasn't large. You could cross the center on foot in 15 minutes. Boutique shops, narrow cafes, little clusters of locals and tourists mixing under awnings. But I wasn't sightseeing. I was looking for answers. At the corner of a quiet street, I found what I needed. A small property office with tinted glass and a bronze plaque above the door. Belfort Coastal Holdings. The same name that appeared twice in my folder. Inside, a man in a soft gray suit looked up from behind his desk. Mid-40s, immaculate grooming, watch that likely cost as much as a used car. "Can I help you?" he asked. I placed one of the documents on the counter. "This name, Tonelli, shows up on multiple transfers connected to Crescent Bay. I want to know why." He blinked. Tonelli was Livia's family name. He recovered quickly, offering a polite smile. "I'm afraid we can't disclose client details." "I'm not asking for details," I said, "just relevance." "Is this part of a development project?" He hesitated. It was tiny, just a flicker in his eyes, but hesitation is information. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I can't help." "I understand," I said and walked out. I hadn't gotten answers, but I had gotten confirmation. This was bigger than a family vacation. As I stepped back onto the street checking my watch, I noticed something across from me. A black SUV parked outside a waterfront restaurant. Tinted windows. Engine running. No plates from the area. Someone inside was watching the entrance. I walked casually, pretending not to notice, but my stomach tightened. Crescent Bay wasn't dangerous, not on the surface. But every town has two versions. The one tourists saw, and the one locals tried not to talk about. I made my way toward the main resort district where Marine and Livia were staying. Their place was pristine. White facades, blue-tinted glass, manicured shrubs, soft music drifting from the lobby. Through the open archway, I could see guests in linen outfits checking in. And then, Marine walked out of the building. Her head was turned as she spoke to someone behind her. A moment later, Livia stepped out beside her, carrying sunglasses and a woven tote. They looked relaxed, as if nothing in the world was wrong. Then a third person joined them. A man, mid-50s, sharp suit despite the heat. I recognized him. He was the same man I'd seen in the photo attached to one of the financial documents. Livia's uncle, Matteo Tonelli. He wasn't here for beach relaxation. Mateo placed a hand on Marin's shoulder casually, almost possessively, guiding the group toward a waiting car. That black SUV. The same one from the restaurant. My pulse thumped once, heavy and deliberate. This wasn't a vacation. This was a meeting, and Marin was being walked into it without knowing a thing. I stepped back behind a stone column, blending into the shade. If I'd known what that meeting in Crescent Bay was truly about, what role Marin was being pushed into, I would have stepped out from hiding right then. Instead, I followed them and uncovered something much darker than a family secret. I kept my distance as the black SUV pulled away from the resort entrance. It glided down the coastal road toward the quieter side of Crescent Bay, where the beach houses thinned out and the palms grew taller. I followed on foot first, then caught a taxi, telling the driver to stay 2 cars behind, no closer. He didn't ask questions. Locals rarely did. The SUV eventually turned down a narrow lane flanked by mangroves, ending at a private gate with a stone sign that read, "Mariner's Hideaway, Private Villas Exclusive, Discreet," the type of place wealthy families used for meetings that weren't meant to be photographed. My heart clenched. Marin stepped out first, looking around with a kind of cautious curiosity. She wore a light dress and sandals, vacation attire, but her posture was stiff, her hands too still at her sides. Livia climbed out next, expression unreadable. And then Mateo joined them, speaking quietly as he led them toward one of the villas. I stayed just close enough to see the door close behind them. Then I waited. 10 minutes. 20. 30. The sun dipped behind the trees, the resort's quieter roads turning gold, then amber. Evening settled slowly, and the air thickened with the sound of insects buzzing over the water. Still no one came out. I stepped into the trees, took the path that circled the villa complex, and found a vantage point near a sliding glass door. Curtains were half drawn, leaving just enough of a gap for shadows to slip through. Inside, 3 figures sat at a long wooden table. Mateo at the head, Livia on the right, Marine on the left, and in front of Marine, papers, lots of them. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a casual conversation, it was a transaction. Even through the muffled glass, I could make out Mateo's voice. Smooth, deliberate, a tone used by people accustomed to giving instructions, not options. "The transfers will start next quarter," he said. "You're the last signature needed." Marin's head snapped up. "Why me? I'm not part of the Tonelli family." "Not by name," Livia cut in. "But by marriage? That doesn't give me financial authority," Marin argued. "I've never been involved in any of your business matters." "You don't need involvement," Mateo said calmly. "Just cooperation." Cooperation? A polite word for pressure. I leaned closer, careful not to snap a twig beneath my foot. Marin picked up one of the papers. "I don't understand any of this. These accounts aren't even in the United States." "Exactly," Mateo replied. "Which is why it's important you keep this quiet." Marin stared at him. Then in a voice so small it made my chest tighten, she asked, "Is this legal?" Silence stretched across the table like a held breath. Livia spoke first. "We aren't breaking laws, we're protecting family assets." I swallowed hard. In procurement, I'd seen this same justification applied to questionable deals. Moves that weren't illegal on paper but were built on bending rules until they groaned. And if Marin signed something she didn't understand, she'd be tied to whatever the Tonelli family had been funneling into Crescent Bay. I needed to get her out, but I couldn't just burst in. Not without leverage. So I did what years of negotiation had taught me. I gathered information. I circled the villa quietly, peering through another window. Papers lay spread on the table. Account numbers from foreign banks, property documents, shell company transfers. Nothing was overtly criminal, but everything smelled wrong. Then I spotted it. One page, partially turned, carried the name Mariner's Hideaway Holdings, the same name etched on the gate outside. Under it, 3 signatures already in place. A 4th line awaited Moran's. This wasn't a family meeting, this was succession planning. A transfer of a business or assets that needed her legal presence to look legitimate. I stepped back into the darkness and pulled out my phone, scrolling to the photos I'd taken earlier of the financial documents in Marin's backpack. Names matched, dates matched. This trip had never been about beaches or togetherness. It was about positioning Marin as a convenient shield, a legally clean face for old money. I tightened my grip on my phone. Enough hiding. I walked back toward the villa and waited near the path that led to the exit. I positioned myself just out of sight. When the meeting finally ended nearly an hour later, the door opened, spilling warm light onto the ground. Marin walked out first. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes glossy in a way I recognized too well. The look of someone realizing they'd been led into something they didn't choose. Livia followed, speaking quietly to Matteo. Their expressions were calm, satisfied, confident. They thought Marin would sign. They thought she'd fold. They didn't know I was here. Marin reached the end of the path, pausing beneath a lantern. She looked up at the sky, exhaling shakily. That's when I stepped forward. She jerked in surprise, eyes widening. "What are you?" she whispered. "I know," I said softly. "I know exactly what they're trying to push you into." Her breath caught. Fear and relief warred in her expression. "How?" she asked. "I saw the papers," I said. "And I saw the names. Marin, you're being positioned to take responsibility for something that doesn't belong to you." Her face crumpled for a moment before she regained control. "What do I do?" "We're not letting them trap you," I said. "But before we make our next move, I need to know something." She swallowed. "What? When they brought you here, what exactly did they promise you in return for your signature?" Marin and I stood beneath the dim lantern outside the villa, the night humming with insects and tension. Her eyes glistened, not with tears but with the fractured realization that the people she'd trusted had brought her here not as family but as a tool. "You asked what they promised me," she whispered. "They said signing the papers would make me part of the inner circle, that I'd never have to worry about money again, that I'd be taken care of." My stomach twisted. "And you believed them?" She hugged her arms around herself. I wanted to. I wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere. Her voice cracked at the edges. But then I saw those numbers, those accounts, those companies, and none of it felt like family. I let the silence settle, giving her space to say the next part on her own. "They needed me," she continued softly, "because my name is clean, because I'm not tied to any of their history." She looked up at me. I wasn't a daughter-in-law to them, I was covered. I stepped closer. "You're not signing anything, not now, not ever." She looked at me with a mixture of fear and trust. Maybe the first real trust she'd shown me since she married my son. "What do we do?" she asked. "We take back control," I said. "First, by not letting them know you figured it out." A shape moved near the villa. Matteo's silhouette appeared briefly against the curtains. "Come on," I murmured. "We need distance." We walked quickly down the path toward the main road, the sound of waves growing louder the farther we moved from the villas. Once we reached the empty street, I called a taxi. Inside the cab, Marin slumped against the seat, the weight of the evening catching up to her. "I should have seen this coming," she said. "No," I replied. "You shouldn't have. Because they weren't acting like family, they were acting like people who wanted something." When we got back to the resort, the lobby was quiet, dimly lit, nearly empty. Marin sank into one of the chairs while I headed to the front desk. "Is Raphael still on night security?" I asked the clerk. "Yes, sir. He's in the office." I found him reviewing paperwork. Raphael was calm, observant, and sharp, one of the few night staff I trusted with my judgment calls. "I need help," I said. He didn't ask questions. "What's going on?" "A guest's family is trying to coerce her into signing legal documents she doesn't understand. I need to make sure they can't reach her tonight." Raphael gave a slow, steady nod. "Consider it done." We set Marin up in one of the private bungalows near the back of the property, away from the main buildings, quiet, safe, untraceable on the standard reservation list. When I returned to her, she sat on the bed with her hands clasped tightly. "They'll notice I'm gone," she murmured. "They'll assume you wanted space," I said gently. "And by the time they realize you're not signing anything, we'll be prepared." She looked at me with a kind of fragile gratitude I hadn't seen from her before. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. The question hit deeper than she intended. "Because I've been on the edge of people's expectations before," I said. "Because I know what it feels like when someone decides you're worth more for what you can offer than for who you are." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. "And because," I added quietly, Your family, not by what they want from you, but by choice. Her lip trembled, but she steadied herself. What happens tomorrow? Tomorrow, I said, you're going to tell them you won't sign anything until you have a lawyer review every page. They'll be furious. Good, I said. Fury reveals truth. The next morning, she asked me to stand with her, which I did. We met her husband, Luca, near the front gardens of the resort. He looked exhausted, hair uncombed, jaw tight. Where were you? He demanded. Matteo called the villa. You disappeared without saying anything. Maren stood straighter than I'd ever seen her. I needed space, she said, and I'm not signing those documents. Luca blinked in stunned confusion. Maren, you don't understand what those papers are. I understand exactly enough, she cut in. And I'm getting a lawyer. His expression twisted. Fear, anger, realization all at once. They're going to be furious, he muttered. I'm not responsible for their reactions, she replied. I'm responsible for mine. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out the stack of papers and placed them gently against Luca's chest. You can return these. He swallowed hard, unable to speak. And just like that, she turned away with her chin lifted, not running, not hiding, walking forward. By the time the family flew back home 2 days later, Maren was no longer the quiet newcomer they thought they could mold. She stayed in Crescent Bay for a week longer, working through her choices, meeting me for coffee at sunrise on the boardwalk, not as a daughter-in-law trying to earn approval, but as someone learning her worth. And when she finally flew home herself, she hugged me before she left. Thank you, she whispered, for standing beside me when I didn't know how to stand on my own. I nodded. You did the standing. I just made sure you weren't alone. A few days later, she called. Not with fear, not with confusion, with clarity. I hired a lawyer, she said, and I'm ready to set boundaries with the family. Her voice was steady, confident. Hers. And that, to me, was the real victory. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.